Stay with me until the end of this one, because what happened to Miriam Voss started the way a lot of bad things do, quietly, and with the best intentions of someone who didn't ask her first. She was 26 years old and standing in the back hallway of the Hargrove County Courthouse, wearing her mother's dress let out at the seams, listening to two men decide her future through a half-open door. One of them was her uncle. The other was a man named Clifton Aldgate, who owned most of the grazing land between Flat Rock Creek and the Wyoming border, and who had been looking for a second wife since the first one left him. Not died, left, and nobody in town talked about why. Her uncle's voice carried the particular lightness of a man relieved of a burden. Miriam didn't wait to hear the rest. She walked back out the front door, down the courthouse steps, and sat on the edge of the horse trough and looked out at the main street of Dunmore, Montana, in the early spring of 1887, and tried to understand how she had arrived at this particular morning. Her father, George Voss, had died 11 months ago. A lung sickness that took him slow and then fast, the way those things do. He'd left her the homestead, 40 acres of decent ground east of town, a mule named Tuesday, and debts she hadn't known about until the bank manager came calling 3 weeks after the burial. The debts were not catastrophic, but they required a plan, and Miriam had been making one, carefully, practically, the way her father had taught her, when her uncle Raymond appeared from Billings and began making his own arrangements on her behalf. Raymond Voss was not a cruel man. That was the thing that made it hard. He genuinely believed he was helping. He said so repeatedly with great sincerity while signing papers she hadn't seen. And now Clifton Aldgate. She sat on the edge of that horse trough for a long time. A woman named Paulette, who ran the dry goods store, came out and swept her front step and pretended not to see her. A dog lay in the middle of the road and didn't move for anyone. The spring wind came down off the mountains, still cold enough to matter. Then she stood up, went back inside, and told her uncle she wouldn't do it. Raymond was patient with her for about 4 minutes. Then he stopped being patient. He used the words responsibility and obligation and the phrase your father's wishes, which Miriam knew to be false, because she had known her father and Raymond had not spoken to him in 9 years. She left before he finished. She had 40 acres, a mule, a dead father's tools, and approximately 6 weeks before the first debt payment came due. She had no close neighbors, no other family within 400 miles, and no husband, which in Hargrove County in 1887 meant, practically speaking, no legal standing to do much of anything without a man's signature. What she had was the land. What she needed was a way to keep it. The man she'd heard about lived 14 miles up the Slate Creek drainage, past the Second Fork, in a place most people in Dunmore referred to simply as the High Country, as though specificity might invite some obligation to go there. His name was Fletcher Dodd. He'd come to the area 6 or 7 years ago. No one was quite sure, and had built himself a cabin and a small operation, and had proceeded to want nothing from the town and had by all appearances gotten exactly that. People had opinions about Fletcher Dodd, the way people in small towns always have opinions about men who don't explain themselves. Some said he'd been a soldier, some said he'd been a lawman, some said he'd done something worth running from, which is what people always say about quiet men in remote places when they don't actually know. What Miriam knew, because old Titus Hake at the feed store had told her, matter-of-factly, while weighing out oats, was that Fletcher Dodd had hired seasonal help from town 2 years running and had paid on time and hadn't caused any trouble, and that his land adjoined hers on the north side along the creek line. She hadn't known that last part. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she loaded Tuesday with enough supplies for a week and rode up the Slate Creek drainage on a Tuesday morning, which she took as either a good sign or the universe having a sense of humor, and went to find her neighbor. The cabin was smaller than she'd expected and in better repair than she'd feared. Someone had put real thought into where to site it. Back against the tree line, south-facing, with a clear view of the approach and the creek running close enough to hear, but not close enough to flood. There was a kitchen garden on the east side, just starting to show signs of last year's work, the soil turned and ready. There were chickens. She had not expected chickens. Fletcher Dodd came around the side of the cabin before she reached the yard, moving with the unhurried attention of a man who'd heard her coming for some time, and had simply been waiting to see what kind of trouble arrived. He was older than she'd imagined. Not old, but past 40, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something quieter than whatever it used to be. He looked at her. He looked at Tuesday. He looked back at her. "You're on the wrong side of the creek," he said. "I came to talk to you," Miriam said. "Most people send a letter. I didn't know if you'd answer." He considered that. "I wouldn't have," he said, and went back around the side of the cabin. She tied Tuesday to the fence post and followed him. He was splitting wood. He picked up the maul, looked at her standing at the corner of the cabin, and set it back down. "You're George Voss's daughter," he said. "I am."
I heard he passed. I'm sorry for it. Thank you.
She hadn't prepared for condolences. She felt the familiar tightening in her throat and pushed it back. You knew him? Not well. He helped me move a downed tree off the creek trail 2 winters ago. We talked some. He was a decent man.
He was. Fletcher Dodd picked up a piece of split wood, looked at it, set it on the pile. What do you want, Miss Voss?
She told him. Not the version she'd rehearsed, which had been more polished and strategic, but the plain version, because standing there in front of a man who didn't seem to have any patience for anything decorative, plain seemed like the right choice. She told him about the debts and the timeline, and her Uncle Raymond and Clifton Aldgate. She told him about the 40 acres on the south side of the creek, and what she intended to do with it. She told him she was looking for a business arrangement, a formal one, documented, in which he would have grazing rights to her north field in exchange for a payment that would cover the bank's requirements, and in which she would maintain ownership of the land and work it herself. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated.
When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You rode 14 miles to propose a grazing lease. Yes, through country you don't know. I managed.
He looked at her for a long moment. The chickens made their small sounds in the yard.
The North Field floods in April, he said. I know. My father dug a secondary channel 7 years ago. It holds. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. How much, he said. She told him the number. He didn't flinch, which she'd expected, or agree immediately, which she'd hoped for. He said, Give me a reason to say yes that isn't your problem becoming my problem. It was a fair question, and she'd thought about it. Because my North Field has the best grass on this side of the drainage and you know it, she said.
Because your herd is bigger than your current grazing can support through a bad summer, and last summer was bad, and the one before that was worse, and because I will keep the terms of any agreement I make, which is more than you can say for most arrangements in this county. He picked up the maul again.
She thought she'd lost him.
Come back Saturday, he said. I'll have an answer. She came back Saturday. He said yes. The papers were drawn up in Dunmore by a solicitor named Herbert Crane, who looked at Miriam Voss with the particular confusion of a man encountering a situation that didn't fit his usual categories,
and who nonetheless did his job correctly.
Because Fletcher Dodd sat across the desk from him and said nothing, and didn't need to say anything because his presence communicated quite clearly that the documents would be accurate and complete. She noticed that about him, the way rooms arranged themselves around his silence. The payment cleared the first debt. The second was still 3 months out, and she had a plan for it. A vegetable contract with the Dunmore Hotel, which was expanding and which needed more produce than the town could currently supply.
She'd already spoken to the hotel manager. She had seed, she had soil, she had a father's knowledge of what that ground would grow.
Raymond appeared once more in May and told her she was being stubborn and impractical, and that Clifton Aldgate had taken his offer to a widow woman up near Havre, and so the opportunity had passed. Miriam thanked him for the information. He left before supper. Summer came. It came hard that year, dry and relentless, and the creek dropped lower than anyone in town could remember. The secondary channel her father had dug held, barely. She worked the garden in the early mornings before the heat, came in at midday, went back out in the late afternoon. She lost 2 rows of beans to a late frost in June that nobody had predicted, and replanted, and the second planting came in thin but usable. Fletcher rode down from the high country in July to check the fence line along the north field. She saw him from the garden and kept working. He stopped at the fence, looked at the cattle that had moved up from the lower pasture, looked at the channel. He came over to where she was working. The channel's silting on the east end, he said. I know. I'm going to clear it this week.
It'll need 2 people.
I'll manage.
He looked at the rows of vegetables. He looked at her hands. I'll come Wednesday, he said.
She opened her mouth to say something independent and thought better of it.
Thank you, she said. He came Wednesday.
They cleared the channel without a great deal of conversation, which suited them both. He knew how to work. She'd had occasion to observe that a lot of men who looked capable were performatively capable. They made much of what they did and the effort it required. Fletcher simply did the work, efficiently and without announcement, and when it was done he washed his hands in the creek and drank from his canteen and said, The East Bank'll hold now through August. I think so, she said. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains.
The creek was running lower than it should, but it was running. My wife used to say, he began, and stopped. She waited. That there's no point fighting the land, he said, finally. Only point is understanding it. She didn't know what to say, so she said, She sounds like she was smart, she was. He picked up his tools. She died 4 years ago. Fever. I'm sorry. He nodded once, the way men nod when they mean something by it and can't put more words to it than that, and he went back up the creek trail,
and she stood there in the late afternoon light, thinking about the particular weight of grief that a person carries quietly for years until it becomes simply part of how they move through the world. She understood it. She was carrying her own. The trouble started in August. A man named Doyle Aldgate, Clifton's younger brother, recently arrived from somewhere east, she wasn't sure where, appeared at her property line on a Thursday morning with 2 other men and a surveyor's instrument, and began to suggest, with great precision and very little warmth, that the eastern boundary of her 40 acres was not where she believed it to be. The discrepancy, according to Doyle Aldgate, amounted to 11 acres, including, conveniently, the north field and the secondary channel her father had built. She had the original survey map. Her father had kept it in an oilskin pouch in the bottom of the document chest, which she'd found the week after he died and read through carefully, understanding then that he'd meant her to find it and understand it.
Doyle said her survey map was incorrect. She said his survey was fabricated.
Doyle smiled in a way that involved only his mouth, and said he supposed they'd see what the county recorder had to say about it. She rode to Dunmore that afternoon, and came back with the county recorder's copy, which matched hers exactly, and told Doyle Aldgate he was welcome to leave her land. He left. He came back 2 days later with a man who said he was a county deputy, although she didn't recognize him, and a document she'd never seen, which appeared to be a second survey registered in 1883 under her father's name, but with numbers that didn't match the land as it existed. She recognized immediately what it was. A forgery.
A good one.
She also recognized what it meant. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had planned it. She thought about who had access to the county records, and who had motive, and who had the resources to fabricate documentation, and she thought about Clifton Aldgate, who had been humiliated by her refusal, and about her uncle Raymond, who had debts of his own, and about how the 2 of them had been seen at Hargrove County's summer cattleman's dinner, which she knew because Paulette from the dry goods store mentioned it in passing, and Paulette noticed everything. She wrote up the Slate Creek drainage that evening. Fletcher came to the door before she knocked. He looked at her face and said, "Come in." She told him what had happened. He sat across the table from her and listened the way he always listened, without interruption, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment.
"You kept copies," he said. "My father taught me to keep copies." "Where?" "In town."
"At the solicitor's office. And one more place."
She hesitated.
"He kept a set with the pastor at the Methodist church. He said church records were harder to get to than county records." Something moved across Fletcher's expression.
"He thought about this," Fletcher said. "He thought about everything."
She looked at her hands on the table. "I just didn't know he thought he'd need to." Fletcher stood and went to the window. The light was going. The mountains were going dark against a sky that still held some color.
"Doyle Aldgate doesn't do anything without his brothers say so," Fletcher said. "And Clifton doesn't move unless he thinks he's already won. I know, which means he has someone in the county office. I think so."
"Or he is someone in the county office."
He turned back.
"Who's the county recorder?" she thought. "A man named Shelby Pruitt.
He's been recorder for 6 years. What do you know about him?" "Not much. He's quiet. He came from—" She stopped. "He came from Billings. Where's your uncle from?"
The silence in the cabin was very complete.
"I need to go to the church," she said.
"In the morning," he said. "You're not riding back tonight." She started to protest, and he said, simply, "The spare room has a latch on the inside," and turned back to the stove, and she understood that was the end of that particular discussion. The pastor, a small serious man named Elbert Wynne, had indeed kept the documents. He produced them from a locked box behind the altar with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been told to keep them safe and had taken the responsibility seriously. He also, when Miriam explained the situation, produced a letter, sealed, in her father's handwriting, with her name on the outside. She sat in the front pew and opened it. Her father had written it a year before he died, when he first began to suspect his lungs were not going to improve. It was practical, like him, and clear, like him, and told her things she hadn't known, that Raymond had borrowed money against the property in 1880, before her father bought him out of his share, and that Raymond had never forgiven him for it. That Clifton Aldgate had approached George Voss 3 years ago about buying the Northfield, and had been refused. That Shelby Pruitt had come to her father with an offer he'd called a courtesy, and George Voss had recognized immediately as a threat. Her father had written it all down. Names, dates, amounts. He'd put it in a letter and given it to a pastor and waited to see if it would ever need to be found. She sat in that church for a long time. Fletcher waited outside. When she came out, she didn't say anything for a moment, and he didn't ask. They walked out to where Tuesday and his horse were tied. "He knew," she said, finally. "Most fathers know," Fletcher said, "when they're leaving their children somewhere dangerous." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "He would have liked you," she said. Fletcher was quiet a moment. I would have liked him, he said. What followed was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make such things dramatic. There were no gunfights. There was a meeting in the county seat with a territorial court clerk who was not connected to Shelby Pruitt or the Aldgate family, who reviewed the documents with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who understood that what he was looking at was significant.
There was a letter sent to the territorial attorney's office in Helena.
There was a second meeting, 2 weeks later, with two men from Helena who were neither warm nor cold, but who asked very specific questions and wrote down very specific answers. Shelby Pruitt resigned his position in September. He did not explain why. Raymond Voss came to Miriam's door in October and asked to talk. She let him in. She gave him coffee. She listened to him for 20 minutes, at the end of which she said, with more evenness than she'd expected to feel, that she would not be taking any legal actions against him, but that she would not be seeing him again, and that she would prefer if he understood this clearly before he left. He left. Clifton Aldgate was a harder problem. The falsified survey had been done carefully enough that his direct involvement was difficult to establish, and he had the resources to continue being difficult. But the North Field was hers, the channel was hers, and the documentation was now in the hands of people above the county level, which meant that any further action on Clifton Aldgate's part would occur under considerably more scrutiny than he'd planned for. He didn't come back. She found the folded paper in November stuck in the split of a fence post on the property line between her North Field and Fletcher's grazing land. It was not a legal document. It was a note, written in the deliberate handwriting of a man not accustomed to writing many notes, which said,
South fence post on the upper field needs replacing before the snow comes. I have posts.
If you want help with it, I'll be free Thursday afternoon. She read it twice. She put it in her coat pocket.
She could not have said precisely when things had shifted. It had been gradual, the way things that matter usually are. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of ordinary ones. The way he'd said her father was a decent man with simple conviction, as though it were a fact as plain as the weather.
The way he'd come on Wednesday without making her ask. The way he'd waited outside the church without asking what the letter said, until she was ready to tell him, and then listened without comment while she found her way through it. She'd thought, after the spring, after the grazing arrangement, that she understood what she was building.
She was building stability. She was building independence. She was building the life her father had believed she was capable of,
And that no one else, not Raymond, not the bank manager, not Clifton Aldgate, had been willing to credit her with. She was still building all of that. But she was beginning to think it might accommodate something more. She went on Thursday afternoon.
He was already at the fence, post driver in hand, the new posts laid out in the frozen ground beside him.
He looked up when she came through the gate. He handed her the post driver without a word, went and picked up the first post and held it in position. They worked down the fence line in the thin November light, alternating who held and who drove, not talking much, just working. The sky was the particular pale gray of a Montana November, the kind that makes the mountains look like they've been cut from lead. Her hands were cold through her gloves. The ground was beginning to frost hard in the mornings, the kind of frost that didn't fully leave at midday.
At the last post, she said,
The grazing arrangement has worked well. It has, he said. I'd like to continue it next year. He looked at her.
He had eyes that were hard to read in the way that honest eyes often are, because they didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. I'd like that too, he said. She nodded. She looked at the fence line, straight and solid against the pale grass.
I'm not.
She started.
She stopped. Started again.
I'm not asking for anything you haven't already offered.
I know that, he said, but I'm also not. She made herself look at him.
I'm not going to pretend I don't notice what's been building here, because I do.
And I'd rather say it plainly than let it sit there and get complicated.
He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass. I haven't been good company, he said, for a long time. You've been honest company, she said. That's rarer. He looked out at the mountains.
She looked at the mountains, too. They were beginning to gather the first real color of the afternoon, the peaks going gold where the sun was still catching them.
I'm not a simple man, he said finally. I don't mean that as a recommendation. I mean it as a fair warning. I know that, she said. I knew it in April. Then why?
Because you came on Wednesday, she said. Because you waited outside the church. Because you wrote a note about a fence post when most men would have sent word through someone else, or not bothered at all. He was quiet again. Then he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words the way he chose his footing on uncertain ground, I'd like to spend some time understanding where this goes. If that's something you'd consider, I'd consider it, she said.
I am considering it.
He nodded.
He picked up the post driver and handed it back to her. She took it. There's a post on the west side that needs looking at too, he said.
Of course there is, she said. and they went to look at it. The winter was long, the way Montana winters are, with a particular quality of silence that either breaks a person or becomes something they learn to live inside. Miriam learned to live inside it. She'd been doing that in one way or another all her life. Fletcher came down from the high country twice a month through December and January, and she rode up once a month when the weather allowed, and they found in those visits something that neither of them had words for yet, but that felt like the beginning of a language they were building slowly and with care. He told her about his wife. Her name was Daisy. She'd been from Ohio. She'd hated Montana winters and loved Montana summers. She'd been the one who'd decided to come west, and had dragged him along with her and had been right about it and had known she was right and had never let him forget it, affectionately, relentlessly, for 8 years. He said it like someone who had finally arrived at a place where he could hold the grief and the warmth of the memory at the same time without one destroying the other. She told him about her father, about the way George Voss had taught her to read a land survey before he taught her to read a novel, about the oilskin pouch and the letter in the church, and the secondary channel he'd dug when she was 12 years old, and shown her how it worked and why, as though he'd always known she would need to understand it herself someday. She said she thought he'd been preparing her all her life for exactly the situation she'd found herself in, and that she didn't know whether to be grateful or heartbroken about that. Fletcher said both, probably. She said yes, she thought so too. In February, he asked her to marry him. He did it sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them, not in any grand way, just directly and with the clear-eyed seriousness of a man who had thought about it carefully and had come to a conclusion he was committed to. He said, "I don't think I can offer you everything you deserve, but I can offer you honesty and work and someone who will not make decisions on your behalf without asking you first. I think that's more than most, and I think you're more than most, Miriam." She sat across from him for a moment. The fire was going in the stove. Outside, the snow was coming down with the particular quietness of a February afternoon, the big soft flakes that mean it will snow for hours. "That's a very considered proposal," she said. "It took me a while to work out how to say it," he admitted. It's the right kind," she said. "The kind that sounds like you." She said yes. They were married in March in Dunmore, at the Methodist church where Pastor Elbert Wynne had kept her father's documents. It was not a large wedding. Paulette from the dry goods store came. Titus Hake from the feed store came. Herbert Crane, the solicitor, came, looking somewhat less confused than he usually did in Miriam's presence, having apparently made his peace with the situation. The hotel manager came, because the vegetable contract had been good for both of them, and he thought of himself rightly as someone who'd played a small role in how things had turned out. Fletcher wore the good coat she hadn't known he had. She wore a dress she'd made herself over the winter, from fabric she'd ordered from a catalog in January, a dark blue wool that her father would have approved of. Pastor Wynne read the vows slowly, and they said them back, and it was not a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, the kind that holds. Afterward, standing on the church steps in the pale March light with the town of Dunmore visible in its ordinary entirety, the mud-rutted street, the false fronts, the mountains behind everything, unchanged and indifferent and beautiful, Miriam thought about the Thursday morning almost a year ago when she'd sat on the edge of a horse trough and tried to understand how she had arrived at her situation. She understood now. Her father had left her the land. The land had led her to the creek line. The creek line had led her to the neighbor she hadn't known she had. And everything after that had been 2 people building something carefully, honestly, with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. Fletcher was talking to Titus Hake about the spring grazing. He caught her looking at him and didn't say anything, just looked back with the quiet steadiness that was, she had come to understand, his particular form of warmth. She looked out at the mountains. The spring was coming up the slopes the way it always did. Slowly from the bottom, the snow retreating a little every week, the brown grass beginning to go green beneath it where the sun hit longest. In another month, the upper pasture would be ready. In another 6 weeks, the garden. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She walked back down the steps to begin it.